He paid $200 to free an orc mother of two. What happened next left everyone speechless. Take my hands if you must, but let my children go free. The debt block at Eastgate Crossing had seen 100 desperate pleas over the years, but the crowd went quiet at this one anyway. Jane Dahlgren stood chained at the wrist, mud and dried blood crusted along one temple. A small boy pressed rigid against her side, and a smaller girl gathered up in her one free arm. The magistrate's clerk read the debt figure aloud again, bored, as if he had not just priced a mother and two children like grain sacks. 200 silver marks, inherited from a dead husband's ledger, called due in full or paid in flesh. George Wynne had come to Eastgate Crossing to sell cattle, nothing more. He stood at the back of the crowd with his purse light and his morning half wasted, and told himself twice that this was none of his business. Then the girl in her mother's arms began to cry, and the crowd laughed at the sound of it, and something in George's chest simply refused to let him walk away. If a debt like this one is enough to pull you in, drop a comment telling us what you'd have done in George's place. And subscribe to the Orc Bond Saga so this family's story doesn't slip past you. Eastgate Crossing sat where 3 trade roads met, a sprawl of muddy stalls and livestock pens that swelled twice yearly into a proper market town, and shrank the rest of the year to little more than a garrison, a tavern, and the debt magistrate's court that gave the place its grim second reputation. Folk from 3 provinces brought their disputes there, their unpaid tithes, their inherited debts, and the block at the square's centre had stood long enough that the wood of it had gone black and smooth from years of hands gripping the rail. Most who stood at the block left with a lighter purse and their dignity intact. A smaller number left in chains, sold into service until the debt worked itself off, a practice the Crown's own law still allowed so long as the term was fixed. Terms that in practice depended entirely on whoever held the paper. An old woman near the front muttered that no good would come of freeing an orc widow with 2 whelps. Besides, that trouble followed her kind, the way crows followed a battlefield. George heard it and said nothing. He crossed the frozen mud before his good sense could catch up to him. 200 marks clears the whole debt, the clerk said, already turning back toward the block. Or she and the whelps go to whoever bids highest. There's no shortage of buyers for strongbacks and an orc's endurance. Whatever her age or her whelp's tempers, I'll clear it, George said. A ripple went through the crowd at that, heads turning to see which fool had spoken. The words left him before he had finished counting what coin he actually carried. Between the cattle money in his coat and 3 winter's savings toward good breeding stock, it came out even, barely. He counted it into the clerk's hand piece by piece, while the crowd murmured at the strangeness of it, one merchant laughing outright that the fool had paid twice what the woman was worth on any honest market day. Jane said nothing as her chains came free, her whole body coiled tight around her children like a wall built of muscle and old scars. Up close, she stood 1.5 heads taller than him, and even filthy and bound, she carried herself like someone who had once commanded far more than a market crowd's stares. You didn't ask what the debt was for, she said finally, voice rough with an accent he had only ever heard in old soldiers' stories. Men do not spend 200 marks on strangers without wanting something back. I didn't ask because it wasn't going to change my answer, he said. Your boy's shaking. Your girl hasn't stopped crying since I got here. That's reason enough for me. She said nothing more, but when he turned toward his cart, she followed, a child gripped in each hand, wary and silent and utterly unwilling to let him out of her sight until she understood what he actually wanted from all this. And neither of them yet understood how far that single choice would carry all 4 of them before the year was through. 2 days' ride from Eastgate Crossing, in a hall built more for cold ambition than warmth, Reeve Cassian Voss heard the report from his steward and set down the coin he had been turning between his fingers. A rancher, he repeated, tasting the word like something spoiled. Bought her out from under my own court before the proper bidders finished their offers. He remembered his brother's death the way other men remembered feast days, with a precision that never dulled. down to the colour of the sky that morning, and the exact words the messenger had used. He had identified the body himself, written the letter that told their mother her youngest son was not coming home. He told himself the debt magistracy was simply the tool at hand, that seizing widows from Dagran's old command was no different than any lord collecting what the law allowed. He did not examine too closely why it always felt better to break those particular families than any other debt he had ever called due. A debt can be disputed long after it is paid, if the paperwork is handled with sufficient care, he told his steward. Send word that the matter remains open. I will see to the rest myself. George's ranch sat 3 miles outside Thornmere village, close by the river. A modest house and a barn built low against the wind across 3 hard seasons. A scatter of cattle grazing the pasture land beyond the corral fence. The roof did not leak. Herbs hung drying from the rafters in bundles tied with twine, and a garden grew behind the barn in rows straighter than any hermit needed to keep them. He had buried a wife and daughter here 4 winters back. Taken by a fever, the frost hadn't broken in time to stop, and he had stopped believing most days. That his quiet was anything but chosen, because no one else in that square was going to, George answered, when Jane asked flatly why a man, with so little to spare, had spent all of it on strangers. Jane spent her first full day at the ranch doing something George didn't understand, until he watched her do it twice. More in the weeks that followed, walking the perimeter slow and deliberate, marking sight lines to the tree line, testing which shutters held and which would need reinforcing before winter's worst arrived. He asked her, eventually, what she was doing, counting how many ways a man could come to this house, and how long we'd have to see him coming, she said, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world to measure a home that way. It is not a habit I know how to set down. He did not tell her that first week that he found the habit oddly comforting rather than strange. It would be some months before he admitted as much aloud. The first 2 nights passed in wary silence. Borin, 11 winters old, watched him from the corner without a word, one hand resting near the belt knife his mother had somehow kept through her chains. Yenna, barely 6, needed exactly 1 day to decide George belonged to her, the way the chickens did. Jane ate only after he had eaten from the same pot, and slept when she slept at all, with her back to the wall and her eyes toward the door. Borin's silence broke over a rope. George caught him one morning trying badly to coil a lariat far too long for his arms, jaw tight with the particular stubbornness of a child determined not to ask for help. Rather than take it from him, George knelt beside him and showed him the loop, the throw, the way a wrist did the real work, if a person let it guide the coil rather than forcing it. A few throws later, the boy landed a clean loop over the fence post, and something in his shoulders loosened that hadn't loosened since the debt block. "You fight like my father did," Warren said that evening, testing the words carefully. "Not with a blade, with patience." The storm that took down 40 feet of the north fence came through on a Tuesday, and it was Jane, not George, who noticed first. She'd been walking her usual perimeter at dawn and found 3 posts snapped clean at the base, wire coiled loose in the mud, a gap wide enough for the whole herd to wander through if the cattle found it before the humans did. She had George and both children out mending it before the cattle woke to the opportunity. Borin hauling fresh posts from the woodpile, Yenna handing up wire while George and Jane worked the post-hole digger between them, trading the handle back and forth without needing to ask. The debt was never rightly mine to carry, Jane said, driving a post home with 3 hard blows while George held it steady. My husband, Dagran, was a Smith captain of no small standing, killed 2 years past in a border skirmish. His death should have passed his holdings to me whole, as our law allows a warrior's widow. But that same skirmish also cost a human nobleman his younger brother, Reeve Cassian Voss, who has spent every season since forging debts against my husband's name. George braced the next post while she checked its lean. I'm not the first, she added, quieter, testing the wire's tension with one hand. There was a woman 2 valleys distant, broken the same way a season before me. I do not know what became of her. They ran short of good posts before the fence was half mended, and George admitted, hauling the last of the salvageable timber from the barn, that replacing the rest properly would eat into money he didn't have to spare. Jane marked the weak stretch with a strip of red cloth so they'd remember to watch it, and told him, working the wire taut of the day word had reached her at the forge. How she had walked the distance to the border herself, rather than wait for a messenger. How Borin, only 9 at the time, had insisted on helping dig the grave with his own hands, rather than be sent away from it. George gave her his own past in return while he worked, the fever winter, the healer who came too late, 4 years of solitude he had built, rather than risk loving anyone again. She did not offer him comfort for it. She only listened, hands never quite stopping their work, and something in that steady attention settled him more than gentler sympathy would have. It was Borin who found the wagon wheel ruts, cutting fresh and deep along the tree line where no cart of theirs had ever gone. Half an hour after the fence was finally strung tight again, he called his mother over without raising his voice. The way she'd taught him, and Jane crouched over the tracks a long while, following them with her eyes to where they vanished into the trees, rather than continuing on to any road. "Someone stopped here and watched the house a while before they turned around," she said. "And they were careful enough about it that I don't like how careful they were, like so many watching from lands far from Eastgate Crossing. None of them yet understood how a single debt paid on a whim would reshape every year that followed. If you want to see how far this unlikely family reaches before the story ends, stay through what comes. The wagon tracks led nowhere, George's own knowledge of the valley could explain, and it was that uncertainty, more than the tracks themselves, that kept Jane walking the perimeter twice a day instead of once through the whole of that week. Whatever unease it left behind burned off in time, into the ordinary work of the season, Yenna trailing George out to gather herbs along the riverbank, naming every plant wrong on purpose just to see if he'd correct her, and claiming a small carved horse that had belonged to his daughter as her own once he told her, haltingly, that a little girl he had loved very much used to play with it, and that he thought she would have liked Yenna having it now. The real trouble that week came from a green colt George had bought cheap at market for its bloodline, and regretted almost immediately. A beast that spooked at shifting shadows, and had already put one hoof-shaped bruise on George's ribs. Jane watched him fail to calm it twice before she stepped in herself, planting her feet wide in the round pen and simply standing there, unmoving, until the colt's own nerves wore thin before hers did. It took the better part of an hour before it finally dropped its head and let her touch its nose, and by then Yenna had climbed halfway up the fence rail to watch. Nearly toppling in when the colt shied one final time, George caught her by the collar a half-second before she hit the dirt. "You could have told me to keep her back," he said, breathless. "I did not think she would climb the fence," Jane admitted, which was as close to an apology as she'd offered him for anything since the debt block. In exchange, in the evenings after, she began teaching him a blade's basics in the yard while the children practiced their own smaller drills alongside, and he paid her back, showing her how to finish gentling the colt properly, how a frightened animal could be settled with patience rather than forced with strength. She absorbed the horsework with the same fierce concentration she gave to combat, muttering more than once that a Smith captain's widow ought to know how to calm a beast as well as she knew how to break a man's guard. George's first real mistake came on an ordinary evening of equipment work, cleaning tack and mending harness by lamplight with the whole family gathered around the table, when he picked up a cracked leather scabbard from the pile without thinking twice, and began working oil into the seams the way he'd mend any broken tool. It was Dagran's, the old Smith captain's own, kept wrapped at the bottom of Jane's travel chest, and among Jane's people. Her dead warrior's gear was never touched by outside hands until a full mourning year had passed. Jane's hand closed over his wrist before he'd gotten 3 strokes in, hard enough to bruise, and she said nothing for a long moment, simply took the scabbard back, and held it against her chest like something he'd tried to steal. She went cold and silent for the better part of the evening, retreating to the far end of the porch with the children trailing after her. And it was Borin who finally came back inside to explain what George hadn't known to ask. George apologized plainly once he understood, without excuses, and asked her to teach him the custom properly, rather than assume he'd get it right on instinct twice. It took the better part of a week and a great deal of careful, wordless work rebuilding the fence's weak stretch together before her guard came all the way back down. When it did, it was over something small. He asked her, unprompted, what the proper mourning gesture actually was, and stood beside her at Dagrun's grave marker while she showed him, getting it right the second time because he had finally learned to ask first. A trip into Thornmere for salt and thread made plain that the village's coldness toward them wasn't only old prejudice running its natural course. An old woman spat at Borin's feet outright as they passed the well, and a travelling grain merchant tried to shortchange George on a sack of seed corn before Jane, reading the scale herself, corrected the man's arithmetic in a voice flat enough that he made up the difference without argument. Hurst, the shopkeeper, refused to sell them anything at all until George laid the coin down and told him plainly that the boy's silver spent the same as anyone's. Once he'd agreed to measure out the thread, Hurst admitted under George's quiet pressing that a well-dressed stranger had passed through weeks earlier, asking pointed questions about the rancher who'd taken in an orc widow. He didn't give a name, Hurst said, jaw tight, but he paid well for answers, and he wasn't the only one asking. George understood, standing in Hurst's doorway, that Voss's reach extended well past his own court. The rumours had already reached the children. A handful of Thornmere boys cornered Borin near the well that same afternoon, repeating words too specific and too cruel to be simple homegrown prejudice. It told George more clearly than anything else how far Voss was willing to reach to win. It was Borin, watching the road behind them as the cart rattled out of town, who spotted the rider sitting motionless on the ridge above the valley road, gone by the time George turned to look properly himself. It was Pfennig who brought the piece none of them had been looking for, arriving at the ranch on a grey afternoon, while George and Borin were up on the barn roof, replacing shingles the last storm had loosened, a folded survey map tucked under one arm. He climbed the ladder himself, rather than wait for them to come down, and spread the map flat across the ridge beam, while George kept working the shingles into place around him. Listening. Crown surveyors had passed through the eastern passes the same season Dagrun died. Pfennig explained, cataloguing ore veins ahead of a planned trade road, and one report buried for 2 years until Pfennig went looking for anything that might explain Voss's relentlessness. It placed a vein of silver ore worth more than the rest of Dagrun's holdings combined directly beneath the smithy. Lands Jane stood to inherit. I have spent 2 years believing this was only ever about a brother's death, Pfennig said, hands not quite steady on the map's corners as the wind tried to take it. He has already sold future mining rights to investors in the capital who believe the land is legally his to sell. If the debt is not settled in his favor soon, he will owe those men a fortune he does not have. Jane climbed the ladder herself once she heard, and sat on the ridge beam with the map in her lap for a long while, tracing the surveyor's careful lines with one finger. It was never only about his brother, she said at last, voice low, while below them Yenna called up asking if anyone remembered she existed. It was never only about me or Dagrun. I was a lock standing between him and a fortune, and I never once knew it. It changes nothing about what we owe him for the fear he's put this family through, George said, driving the last shingle nail home harder than it strictly needed. But it explains why he has never once stopped coming, and why he is not likely to stop now that half the capital's money is riding on him, finishing what he started. They argued it out that night over what remained of supper, plates pushed aside, the map spread across the table between them, whether to sell the mining rights themselves before Voss could force the issue, whether to bury the survey report, whether simply knowing his true motive would be enough to protect them at all. In the end, Jane decided plainly that she would not let a vein of silver dictate her choices any more than a forged debt already had, and did something about it before she could talk herself out of it. She had Fennig copy the survey report twice that same night. One copy sealed and sent by the fastest rider they could pay toward the Crown's own archive office in the capital. The other locked in the smithy strongbox, where no fire or theft could easily reach it. If Voss meant to use the truth as a weapon, she intended the Crown to already have a copy of it before he ever swung. "That is a 3-week ride each way," George said, watching her seal the letter. "He may move against us long before any answer comes back. Then we will have done what we could with the time we had," she said, and pressed the wax down hard. It was Borin, banking the fire before bed, who asked quietly whether Voss would come himself now or send men instead. Neither of them had a good answer for him, and none of them slept easily again until the matter was settled for good. Calving season arrived hard that spring. 3 cows dropping within the same wretched night, and a pack of wolves drawn down from the high country tested the corral fence before the last calf had even found its feet. George had managed calving alone every year since his wife died, and he told Jane plainly she owed him nothing here. She was already pulling on her boots before he finished the sentence. "I did not free myself from one debt to start weighing new ones against a family," she said. "Tell me where the wolves are likely to come from, and I will make certain they regret trying." They worked through the night in a rhythm that surprised them both, George easing a breech calf free with hands practiced from years of solitary work, Jane standing sentry at the pasture's edge with a torch in one hand and her blade in the other, driving off 2 wolves bold enough to test the fence line. By dawn, 3 healthy calves stood wobbling in the straw, and George, hollow-eyed and finally sitting still, told Jane it was the first calving season in 4 years he hadn't spent entirely alone. She said nothing to that, but she sat down beside him in the straw anyway, close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away from it. They were still sitting there, half asleep against the stall boards, when Borin came running from the house with the notice in his hand. A rider had come and gone while they were busy with the calves, leaving only a folded paper nailed to the gatepost rather than waiting to deliver it in person. Voss's second notice offered no scout's excuse this time, only a formal courtesy delivered while they were too exhausted to properly brace for it, a claim that Dagran's debt remained an open question, and that the widow ought to present herself for a hearing before spring's end. "He wants us frightened into moving first. So any flight looks like guilt," Jane said, reading it over while she stripped off her blood-crusted gloves at the wash basin. "If we run, he wins without ever needing to prove a thing. Then we don't run," George said, already reaching for the ledger to see what coin they could spare for the journey to answer it properly instead. What he found there was worse than he'd hoped. A proper advocate to stand with Jane before a hostile court would cost more than the ranch had to spare. Not after the storm's lumber and the letter to the capital had already eaten into what little cushion they'd built. He sold 2 young steers to a Thornmere buyer at a poorer price than he'd have gotten come autumn, and said nothing to Jane about the loss until she found the empty stalls herself and understood exactly what he'd traded to buy her a fair hearing. "You should have asked me first," she said, more unsettled by the gesture than grateful for it. "I didn't ask because it wasn't going to change my answer," he said, echoing her own words back at her without quite meaning to. And for once she had no argument ready. In his own hall that same week, Voss met a young clerk named Bellamy over a debt of the clerk's own that no honest wage would ever clear. Voss offered to forgive it in full in exchange for a promise, held in reserve, that Bellamy would remember certain records differently if the day ever came he needed him to. Bellamy took the offer the way drowning men take rope. Deep in the coldest stretch that followed, Yenna woke burning with fever, shaking despite every blanket in the house. The old dread rose in George instantly, the exact shape of the night he'd once run through frozen streets for a healer who arrived too late. He said nothing of that part. He only moved, boiling water, mixing the tinctures he trusted most. "Someone has to ride for the healer," Jane said, "and the roads are already bad." George would not leave his daughter's side, and Jane would not leave Yenna's, which left the errand to Borin, 12 winters old and white-faced with fear, saddling the fastest horse himself, while his mother shouted instructions after him into the dark. He rode the 3 miles to Thornmere and back through freezing rain that turned the road to a river of mud. The healer's cart lodged twice along the way, and freed both times by Borin's own back and a length of rope he'd had the sense to bring. Jane did not leave her daughter's side for 2 days after that, and George did not leave hers. She hummed deep in the second night a low tune in her own tongue, and told him it was the song orc mothers sang over sick children in her clan. "I lost a daughter to a fever just like this," he admitted. "I couldn't get help to her in time. It will not end that way here," Jane said, fierce with the certainty that owed nothing to actual knowledge and everything to refusing any other outcome. "I have buried a husband. I will not bury a child in this house too." The healer arrived to find the worst already broken, Yenna sitting up indignant and demanding broth. Borin, soaked through and shaking with cold himself by the time he finally slept, had proven something to all 3 of them that no amount of rope coiling ever could have. The rider who came next did not claim lost roads. He arrived at dusk, polite and unhurried, asking for shelter for the night in a voice too smooth for a man supposedly caught out by weather, and George, still trusting in those days, gave him a meal and a place by the fire without a second thought. It was over that meal, passing bread and stew across the table, that Borin recognized the signet ring the man wore beneath his glove, the same mark from the notice announcing his mother's original debt, and said nothing at all until the man had ridden off into the dark, thanking them warmly for their kindness. He wasn't lost, Borin told them once the man was gone, still holding the bread he'd been about to pass. He was counting the house. How many doors, how many of us there are, and where each of us sleeps. "He does not send scouts unless he already means to move," Jane said, hand going to the belt knife she now wore openly rather than tucked away. "We have days, not weeks." They spent those days preparing in ways the children were only half told about. Jane walked the perimeter again, sharper this time, marking where a man might come from the tree line and how fast. George boarded the low window at the back of the house and quietly moved the stacked hay bales further from the barn wall, though he told Yenna only that it needed reorganizing before the thaw. It was Jane's idea to send Yenna to spend a few nights with the Marrow family 2 farms over, old friends of George's who asked no questions, and simply took the girl in with a fierce hug and a promise to keep her safe, leaving one less person for either of them to protect if the worst came. The night before he rode for the ranch himself, Voss stood alone studying a map of the valley. The small mark his scout had drawn for George's land now circled twice over in dark ink. His steward asked carefully whether it was truly worth 12 men and his own presence over a debt already twice disputed. "They have waited long enough," Voss said. "So have I. My brother did not get to argue his case before he died. Neither will she, and neither will the rancher who thinks 200 marks bought him the right to stand in my way." Voss came within the week, a dozen armed men behind him, claiming the debt had never lawfully been cleared. "You bought nothing that was ever truly mine to sell," he told George in the yard, cold and precise. "The debt stands. The woman and her whelps return with me today, or this house burns with all 4 of you inside it." Jane moved first, placing herself between Voss's men and her children without a heartbeat's hesitation. "You will not touch them while I still breathe." The fight was short and vicious. A thrown torch caught the hay barn's dry roof almost at once, and within minutes the fire had leapt the yard entirely, catching the house's own eaves before anyone could beat it back. George put himself in front of Borin, hay-fork in hand, every lesson Jane had drilled into him, settling into his arms without conscious thought. Jane herself cut through Voss's men with 2 years of stolen dignity, finally given somewhere to land. Her blade moving in patterns George had only ever seen her practice slow and careful in the yard, now unleashed at full and terrible speed. A blade meant for George's throat caught his shoulder instead when he turned half a second too slow, and he went down hard against the corral fence, vision swimming, blood soaking fast through his shirt in the freezing air. Borin screamed his name. Jane, breaking off mid-strike to reach him, took a glancing cut across her own forearm for the distraction it cost her. He forced himself upright on will alone, enough to hold the last man back until Thornmere's own Reeve arrived at a run, alerted by smoke visible for miles against the dawn sky, bringing armed villagers behind him, Hurst among them, cudgel raised, no longer looking at Jane's family with suspicion. Voss himself was taken, spitting fury, insisting his writ was lawful and his revenge merely justice long overdue. "I bought your debt not knowing what it would cost me," George managed, breath ragged. "I'd pay it again. Every year since. I have never had anyone stand between my children and danger who was not bound to them by blood," Jane said, voice raw. "You are bound to us now, whether either of us planned it. The danger did not end with Voss in chains." 2 mornings later, while George's shoulder was still too raw to lift a cup unaided, the same Reeve who had ridden to their aid returned with a different errand entirely. A warrant, sworn out by one of Voss's remaining allies on the regional bench, holding George on suspicion of causing a wrongful death in the fighting, since one of Voss's hired men had not survived the night. Voss himself, still awaiting his own trial in a cell 2 doors down, had smiled when he heard the news, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since the fire. Pfennig said grimly when word reached the ranch, exactly the kind of maneuver a man made when he could no longer win outright, and needed only to delay long enough for his investors to lose patience and simply seize the land by force of their own hired men. Instead, George spent 6 days in a cell in the county seat, and the ranch did not stop needing hands in his absence. Jane rebuilt what she could of the scorched fence herself, with Borin hauling timber alongside her, working through blistered palms rather than sit idle. She had faced Voss's men with a blade in her hand and felt less powerless than she did some mornings on that ladder. Each afternoon she walked into the county seat and sat outside the jail wall until the guards drove her off at dusk, forbidden even to speak with George beyond a few grudging minutes once a day through a barred slot in the door. Borin spent those same 6 days in Pfennig's cramped record room instead, working through box after box of the Reeves' old case files by lamplight. It was Borin who finally found the flaw that freed his father. A witness log, misfiled 2 shelves from where it belonged, proving the dead man had drawn his blade first. The charge collapsed within the hour once the advocate laid it before the presiding magistrate. George walked out of that cell gaunt, unwashed, and furious in a way his family had never seen from him before. 6 days of watching Voss's reach extend even from behind bars, settling into something harder and more determined in him than the ranch fire itself had managed. "I am done letting that man decide what happens to this family from a distance," he told Jane that night, helping her set the last fence post they'd started the day the warrant came. "Whatever it costs, I want this finished properly, in the open, where he can no longer buy his way around it." Voss, in his own cell 2 doors down, had spent those same 6 days working the only tool still left to him, his voice. He wrote letters to every ally his family's coin could still buy, calling in favors from men who owed him more than they wished to admit, arranging for Bellamy's silence to hold just a little longer and for 2 of his former investors to appear, if called, as character witnesses rather than men with a fortune riding on the outcome. He was still, even behind bars, the most patient man any of them had ever crossed, and he intended his trial to be his last and best-prepared performance yet. Voss's trial opened a month later, delayed by his family's coin. Borin stood before the court himself, small for his 12 years against the high bench, and described the rider's boots and the signet ring plainly, without once looking away from Voss's cold stare across the chamber. Jane testified after him, laying out the timeline of her husband's death and the debt's sudden appearance a full year later. her voice steady even as her hands, out of sight beneath the witness rail, gripped the wood hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Bellamy, when pressed under oath about the ledger he'd produced, broke almost at once, admitting Voss had bought his silence months before the attack ever happened. In the same week, the second notice arrived. The confession alone did not satisfy the presiding judge, who wanted independent proof before he'd strike the debt from record, giving the court until sundown, or the matter would be adjourned for a full season, while a royal auditor was summoned from the capital. It was Ressa Blackhollow, a second widow broken the same way a season before Jane, who rode 3 valleys through a single afternoon with her own late husband's matching ledger clutched against her chest. Arriving with barely an hour of daylight left to spare, mud-splattered and breathless, dropping the ledger onto the clerk's table before she'd fully caught her breath. Faced with a bribed clerk, a widow's forgery, and Pfennig's own survey map explaining exactly what Voss had been so desperate to secure, the court struck the debt for good. It was the presiding judge himself who noted, almost as an aside, that a duplicate of the same survey report had reached the Crown's own archive office months earlier by a widow's own hand, sealed and sent long before any trial was ever called. Proof, he said, that whoever had forged the debt against her had not counted on her moving first. Jane said nothing to that beyond a single glance toward George, who remembered exactly what 2 young steers had cost to buy them that day, and did not regret a single coin of it. Voss lost his magistracy, his lands, and the investors he'd promised a fortune he never rightfully owned, sentenced to exile from every road he'd once ruled like a private kingdom. He said nothing as judgment was read, though his eyes found Jane once across the chamber, and the hatred in them had not diminished by any measure at all. Jane's own clan elders reached Thornmere soon after. Coming to reclaim her standing, she had been denied for 2 years. Dagrun's holdings restored, her council seat reinstated, her children recognized once more as heirs to a name Voss had tried to erase. "I am owed my place among my own people," she told George in the ranch yard, Borin and Yenna close at her sides. "I could take my children and go, but I do not want to walk away from the one man who asked nothing of me before he knew what it would cost him. Come with us if you are willing," she said. "Not as an ornament kept for show, as my equal, and as father to 2 children who have already decided you belong to them." For a moment George said nothing at all, weighing everything the offer truly meant. He thought of every hall he would enter as the only human present, every council meeting where his voice might count for less, no matter how sound his judgment, of 6 days in a cell that had taught him exactly how far Voss's reach could still extend even in defeat. He was afraid, plainly and honestly, that he would prove more of a burden than help to a woman who commanded real respect among her own people. But he thought, too, of Jane's hand steady on a torch through a night of wolves, of a boy who fought with patience instead of a blade, and rode through freezing rain to save his sister, of a girl who had claimed him the way she claimed the chickens and never once let go, of a family built from nothing but one stubborn refusal to walk away. "I never wanted your husband's holdings," he said. "I wanted a family again, after I'd stopped believing I'd ever have one." The resistance came exactly as she had warned. Word of the marriage reached the full council within days, and the debate ran 2 full sessions before any decision was reached. An elder named Threska argued that a widow of Jane's standing owed her clan a match that strengthened their bloodline rather than diluted it, that whatever debt she owed the rancher could be repaid in coin without binding her name to his for the rest of her days. Another, older still, countered that the clan's oldest laws had always allowed a warrior's widow to choose her own path once mourning had passed, and that no council in living memory had overturned that right without cause graver than simple disapproval. Pfennig tipped the argument, rising from his usual quiet corner to remind the council that the man they debated excluding had stood between Dagrun's last heirs and a blade meant to finish what Voss's fraud had started. and that a council valuing honour above convenience owed him at minimum a fair hearing, a rival smith named Gorick, who had long hoped to court Jane himself once proper mourning had passed, demanded the old right to challenge George's worth before the full council, rather than accept Fenwig's argument outright. George answered not with a blade he could never win, but the alternate trial still allowed under the clan's oldest law, 3 days alone on the widow's climb, a stretch of exposed rock and stunted pine that had turned back more confident men than him, judged by whether the land itself would have him. Borin walked the first mile with him before the elders sent the boy back, telling George plainly that he expected him to return. The second night brought cold sharp enough to bite through every layer he owned, and he kept himself moving through the worst of it, thinking of Jane's hands setting Borin's splint, of Yenna's fierce insistence that no one in her family would be lost to fever again. He returned on the third day, frostbitten but alive, and even Gorick admitted before the council that the human had earned something real. The wedding in early summer honoured both their worlds. Among the clan, they crossed blades before Fenwig and spoke oaths of protection over each other's line, Borin and Yenna standing witness in clothes still a little stiff from newness. It was there, before the full assembly of elders, who had spent a season deciding whether to accept him, that Borin stepped forward unprompted and named George to the gathered clan as his father, plain and unhesitating, in front of every elder who had ever doubted the match. A silence fell over the hall at the word, the old, formal kind of silence a room holds when something has genuinely shifted in it, benches creaking as people leaned forward without meaning to. Even Gorick, after a long moment, inclined his head. Yenna, not to be outdone, tugged George's sleeve in front of the entire assembly and asked, loud enough for the back rows to hear, whether father was going to dance with mother now that the oaths were done. The word landed harder on him than any blade had all year, and it was a long moment before he trusted his voice enough to answer her. The whole silence broke into something warmer than laughter, and one of the eldest among them was heard to remark that no forged ledger in the world could argue with that. A season later, at the rebuilt ranch house by the river, George spoke his vows again in the plain words of his own people, before the handful of neighbours who had never stopped counting him a friend. Hurst came to that ceremony too, and left behind a length of good wool cloth with no note attached beyond his name. 3 years passed. Borin, 15 and taller than his mother by half a head, split his days between the rebuilt smithy and George's ranch, determined to master both the forge and the herd, rather than choose between his mother's world and his father's. Yenna, 10 and afraid of nothing, shadowed Fenwig on market days, declaring loudly that she meant to catch the next Voss before he ever reached a debt block. And Fenwig, delighted by the ambition, taught her his ledgers in earnest, muttering to anyone who'd listen that the girl had a sharper eye for a false seal than clerks 3 times her age. The herd had long since recovered, a good carving season and a few neighbours who quietly extended credit, seeing to that within 2 years. And Jane, standing among the council, had grown steadier each season, her judgment on trade disputes sought out now by the very elders who had once opposed her marriage most loudly. It was Yenna's idea, that third spring, to travel back to Eastgate Crossing for the cattle trade. George still kept up out of old habit more than needed. The debt block still stood in the square's centre, black wood worn smooth from years of hands, though a newer, gentler magistrate had taken Voss's old seat and let it stand mostly empty since. Jane stopped before it a long moment, one hand resting on the rail without quite meaning to, while Borin watched her with the careful attention he'd learned from her years ago, and Yenna tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking quietly whether this was really the place where everything had started. "This is the place," Jane told her. "Your brother was 9 winters old and terrified, and I did not believe anyone in that crowd meant any kindness at all." While George settled the cattle accounts, Jane noticed a thin woman standing near the block with 2 small children clinging to her skirts. A debt clerk, reading figures aloud to a crowd not so different from the one that had once gathered around her own chains. She crossed the square without a word to anyone, And by the time George finished his business, the debt stood cleared, paid in full from coins she had been saving without telling him what for. And a stranger walked free with her children exactly the way Jane once had. "You didn't ask what the debt was for," George said afterward, unable to help the smile in it. "I didn't ask, because it wasn't going to change my answer," she said. And for a moment, neither of them needed to say anything more at all. On an evening much like the one that had first brought them together, storm clouds gathering soft over the hills, George mended a strap by the hearth while Jane worked beside him. The children's laughter, carrying in from the yard where Borin was teaching Yenna a footwork drill far too advanced for her years. The herd grazed quietly beyond the corral fence, calves from that first hard spring grown now into steady, sturdy stock, and somewhere past the tree line, a horse Jane had gentled herself nickered once and went still. "Remember when you told me you didn't ask what the debt was for," she said. "Because it would not have changed your answer." "It wouldn't have," he said. "It still wouldn't if I had it all to do again, even knowing everything it would cost, the fire, the cell, the 6 days I couldn't hold either of you. I'd count that silver into the same clerk's hand tomorrow morning if it meant this." She took his hand, rough palm against rough palm, and outside the rain began to fall soft over a yard where the children's laughter did not stop for it. A magistrate had once tried to sell a mother and her children like grain sacks in a market square, believing coins could erase what a family was worth. A rancher with nothing to spare had proven, in front of an entire clan hall gone silent to hear a boy call him father. Exactly how wrong that reckoning was. If George and Jane's story earned a place in your heart, let us know which moment hit hardest in the comments. And subscribe to Orc Bond Saga so you're there for the next family the world tried to write off.